Today on the monthly Rebuilding the Canadian Economy in the Post-COVID Era, Budget 2021. Is it a plan to do just that or more election politics? Sean Speer and Robert Asselin will deconstruct the federal spending plan. Both were economic advisors to Canadian prime ministers, one conservative, one liberal. So welcome. I'm Pamela Wallin, your moderator. Before we begin today, let me bring your host in, Greg McDougall of Government Analytics. Greg?
Thank you, Senator. And again, it's a huge opportunity for us and a privilege, honor, all those wonderful superlatives to have such distinguished guests. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking a time to put a voice behind all the data. And again, Steve and I are just really excited to have you guys here.
That's great. So let's begin. I know for all of you who have joined us on your invitation, you have two more lengthy bios of our two guests today. Sean Speer, the former senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper, now with the Munk School and the Public Policy Forum Fellow for Strategic Competitiveness. That sounds extremely important. Robert Asselin is the former budget and policy advisor to Prime Ministers Paul Martin and Justin Trudeau, and he is now the senior VP of policy at the Business Council of Canada. So gentlemen, we've had a few days now to digest the budget, the first one in 2 years, the largest one ever physically and in terms of spending as well. I just want to go back a moment. In the Prime Minister's mandate letter to Minister Friedland, it stressed the need to, and I'm quoting here, avoid creating new permanent spending. Do we need a new letter? Robert, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it says a lot about the mandate letters, doesn't it?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I think they decided that the budget, for political reason, probably was more important than follow the mandate letters, which is not, I guess, well read by a lot of people. I'll say a few things about the budget, and I don't want to go into the politics. I'll leave others maybe more qualified than I am to comment on it. But I think the most astute criticism I could make of it is there's a disconnect between where the economy is right now, or how the economy is doing in the short term, and how this government has come and qualified the need for a short-term stimulus. I think would be the $100 billion and how they went to spend most of it this fiscal year. I think that's the main disconnect, and the main criticism I would make of this budget is this not connected to long-term growth. And we can talk about the substance of it later, but I think overall that's the main kind of difficulty I have with the budget.
But that is, those are the words that we're hearing from the Prime Minister and from the Finance Minister, that I think, as she put it, this is the opportunity to reimagine Canada and to build back better. And these are all phrases not about dealing with the impact of the pandemic today, but with rethinking the federal role and whether they want to expand it in this country. Robert, just a word, and then Sean will give you your time.
Yeah, and on that, I would be constructively negative as well, in a sense that I don't think the budget in itself represents a credible economic strategy going forward. If that was the goal, to build back better, I don't like necessarily that expression, because I think it's too broad and too wide. But I think although there are some measures that are interesting and probably worth applauding in this budget, I think overall it lacks a coherent vision for the future, an economic vision for the future that I'm not seeing. I think it's too much, too unfocused, too unimaginative, and just too much spending, frankly, would be my comments.
Sean, do you agree?
Senator Wallin, thanks for the invitation, and to Greg and Steve for hosting today's session. I'm in a bit of a funny place here, where I'm the conservative having to defend a liberal government from someone who's previously worked in a liberal administration. I think maybe to start, where I'm prepared to give Minister Freeland and the government a degree of sympathy, or a degree of flexibility. is the context, of course, in which the budget was produced. I think if you would have asked Minister Freeland several weeks ago, she would have envisioned this budget really focused on post-pandemic recovery, looking on the other side of the worst of the pandemic. And of course, that's not the case. We've had in recent days and weeks rising cases in the province of Ontario and elsewhere. And so Carleton University professor Jennifer Robson described the budget as essentially two budgets. One budget focused on the kind of ongoing immediacy of the pandemic, and that included measures like extension of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and the subsidies for businesses and so on. And then a second budget that starts to shape what a post-pandemic vision might look like. And I think on the first budget, I'm inclined to defer to the government. Some of those measures are terribly important for businesses and households, and probably make sense in the immediate term. On the longer term measures and the longer term vision, I'm inclined to agree with Robert that the biggest challenge facing our country, if you're able to look beyond the immediacy of the pandemic, is the fact, Senator Wallin, that we've been stuck now for 2 decades with real GDP growth averaging less than 2%. What we've come to call it the Public Policy Forum is Canada's 2% trap. And if I was advising the minister, I would have been focused like a laser on developing a kind of comprehensive policy program around elevating economic growth, elevating Canadian productivity. Higher rates of economic growth are a necessary but not sufficient condition to improve outcomes for Canadian businesses, Canadian communities, Canadian households. And I do think where Robert's criticism is on the nose is that this is a budget that in my view neglects this overriding challenge of how do we get our economy growing faster than it's been growing, not just in the past year, but frankly over the past 2 decades.
Well, this is where we've seen some interesting, I guess, twists and turns, because we're putting a lot of money. The government is throwing literally trillions of dollars into people's hands and pockets and businesses and economies. And when at a time when it wasn't always needed. Many people needed it, but not everybody needed it. So it wasn't particularly targeted. So that seems to be an issue when you keep just, where they've extended these programs again, which is going to have a little bit of a, it can have a negative impact too. As we saw last summer, people collecting CERB didn't want to go back out and work when there was work to be done. So Robert, then back to you on this, and I know you alluded to this earlier, but is this part of the problem? We're throwing money at a problem that is actually very, very narrow and needs to be targeted.
Yeah, I would agree with the premise of your question. I think most of the targeted help that the government has put forward is still necessary, but not enough focused on the sectors that need help. And 13 months after the beginning of the crisis, we now know what are where are the kind of bottlenecks or the supply issues in the economy. And so I would have focused a bit more on that. And I think, for political reasons, it's always difficult, as you know, for the government to start something and say, suddenly, just before an election, I'm going to take it out. And I think this is what the government has struggled with, is to keep some of these programs in place, because obviously people always like to receive money. But I don't want to give the impression, though, that some of that aid or that targeted focus is not necessary. I think some sectors still need it, obviously.
The bigger question, Senator Wallin, is the commitment to $100 billion stimulus over the next 3 years. To put that in context for some of our participants, that is roughly double the size of the stimulus program that the Harper government enacted in response to the global financial crisis in 2009. So we're talking serious dough here. And one of the odd things about the commitment to enact a $100 billion stimulus program is it was made in December 2020, before we knew the kind of economic conditions in which it would be rolled out. Yet the budget itself says that the lost economic output over the course of the pandemic will be mostly recovered in 2021. In other words, I think there's a real question about whether we need a magnitude of stimulus represented in this $100 billion plan unveiled in Monday's budget. And then secondly, and I think as importantly, is if you were going to spend $100 billion in the name of supercharging economic growth in this country, I'm not sure that you would have selected the kind of panoply of measures reflected in the budget. Just one example, for all of the I think Robert observed in a post-budget commentary more than 270 individual measures in this budget. Right. Very little focus, incidentally, on increasing public R&D, which is an area where Canada underperforms relative to the OECD, and which would be more closely connected to innovation and growth and productivity that we need versus some of these other spending commitments they've made. So I guess just in sum, as the real question for me is less about the individual measures in response to the ongoing challenges with the pandemic, and more that the choices the government has made, both in size, but more importantly in kind of the selection of particular measures that I don't think are going to lead to higher rates of growth, and instead it's just going to leave us with larger deficits and larger debt, and at the end of the day, not much to show for, and that's the kind of missed opportunity in this week's budget.
Well, let me just follow up on that for a moment, because we saw a lot of messaging, political messaging in this budget. The language alone in the sections of the spending: a healthy environment for a healthy economy, protecting our shared values, all of this kind of language. And the daycare proposal, the childcare proposal, is being promoted as something that will help create more productivity because you'll get women back in the workforce. The flip side of that issue is that that's a cost shared program and the provinces are broke, and the chances of this happening anytime soon are slim. So Robert, I mean, was it more politics than a real attempt to get at questions like productivity, which is such a big problem in this country?
Yes, it is. On the childcare, I'll make a few comments on the childcare proposal. First, I think the overall objective is a sound one, and one that I think is something that would make the economy more productive if we bring back more women into the labor force. That being said, I'm really worried about the execution, implementation aspect of it. I was there in 2004 when Prime Minister Martin did something similar with Ken Dryden, as some will recall. Yeah. It took about a year to negotiate with provinces, and it was very difficult. And it was about half of the money that is put on the table right now. And there's a lot of difficulty on imposing to provinces the model that the government is trying to push, which is more or less what Quebec is doing. And I see a lot of implementation, execution challenges there. There are obviously reasons why provinces will not think that the Quebec model is the best, or the one that they want to follow for all kinds of reasons. And more broadly on productivity, I'd say that this budget, for me, again, does not represent a comprehensive plan to focus on what I'll call the supply side. It's mostly, when we talk about short-term stimulus, you're basically boosting demand. And what we know is by the amount of savings that is out there, about 200 billion, and all this pent-up demand that's just waiting to get released when we open up again, there'll probably be too much demand in the economy, and I don't think that was a strategic, well thought out way to go about it.
Those distortions, which is that's what's led to the overheated housing market, is you've actually got savings and money, and so you're doing it. Sean, the other question I want to raise, and it's signaled by the daycare plan as well. And we saw the recent decision of the Supreme Court of Canada on the carbon tax, which basically says if there's a national emergency, the federal government can intrude on provincial space to a certain extent. At least that was the majority decision. The same could apply here. The signals that they're sending that the feds will use their federal spending power and this ability to print endless supplies of money to push this. There's going to be pressure on premiers to respond to this program and do something when they're claiming that they're broke, which they are, because there was no increase to the federal health transfers to help them deal with COVID.
Yeah, I think Robert's point that the major question with respect to the government's ambitions on childcare is the intergovernmental dynamic and whether they're able to make progress, and that may require abandoning a 50-50 split if they want some of these provinces to sign on. If I can just make one more broader point, though, Senator Wallin. Viewers won't be surprised to hear that politics was part of the construction of the budget. That's the construction of any budget, but particularly one conceived in a minority parliament. But I think if we chalk this all up to politics, we actually kind of minimize the bigger role of ideas here. It goes back to something you outlined in your first question to Robert, which is to say, I do think the government has a fairly ambitious, what I would describe as ideological, a sort of progressive vision that seeks to kind of push back against what they view is a kind of conservative orthodoxy that has, sort of shaped public policy making in Canada for the better part of the past 25 or 30 years. And Monday's budget, when you look at childcare, when you look at the $15 minimum wage, when you look at a number of other major progressive priorities, this represents, I think, a fairly significant kind of philosophical and intellectual expression of a new confident progressivism in Canadian politics. And if you're a progressive, I suspect that's exciting and interesting and the kind of thing that will motivate you. If you have misgivings about these ideas and their kind of growing currency in our political debate, then I think there's an onus to challenge them with an alternative vision. And I think the Conservative Party needs to get its act together, that it is not communicating, not articulating an alternative vision rooted in sort of small c conservative values and principles to take on this kind of newfound progressive orthodoxy that is if you look at polls, pretty popular with the Canadian public. So it's happening at the level of politics, but I think there's something really interesting, important to recognize happening at the level of ideas as well.
Okay, let me just pick up on that, because we're seeing the same ideas or the same battle reflected stateside as well with the election of Biden. But what is becoming kind of acceptable or common currency or even a positive thing is modern monetary theory. We're seeing it played out. Just keep spending money because interest rates are low, so we can afford it. Just print more, spend more, make all the changes that you want, ideological or fiscal, and it'll be okay because it won't cost us that much in the end. I was just listening to somebody from Harvard the other day make this pitch. And I mean, I don't see it so much as a theory as just a kind of a straightforward justification. We're going to spend, get used to it. Robert, what's your thought?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think worth, highlighting in this webinar, most economists obviously disagree with the premise of this theory for good reason, is that supply of money as value in the economy. And I think it makes a lot of sense to disregard this theory. But one thing I think we need to bring into context, and the reason why I think central banks have kind of changed the way they think about this, is really the 2008 great financial crisis, where I think some of the accommodative policies were maybe they were generous, but they were not as open-ended as they are now, and it's kind of a reaction to this crisis that now I think the central banks have taken kind of a different way of looking about it, including employment figures and tolerating higher inflation in the short term. Where I think where I'm uncomfortable, Senator, is it's not clear to me what is the clear threshold here for central banks.
Right.
What's acceptable employment? Is it 4%? Is it 6? Is it 7? It varies, and how can you stop inflation when it goes out the door and it's kind of too late to stop it? I guess would be my other worried. And Larry Summers has spoken, the famous economist in the U.S. that has served under different Democratic president, has warned a lot of people about this. Is the problem with inflation is when it's out, it's really hard to stop. You can obviously stop it, but you're causing another recession, and you affect poor people disproportionately because higher prices are more dangerous for people that have less money. And so this is the kind of lack of guidelines, I think, in this debate that is worrying me more than the fact that central banks have actually stepped up more than usual.
Yeah, I want to pursue that because I'm looking here at, all the stories we've seen about the new governor of the bank, Malcolm, smart guy. Everybody says he's, really a good call, but he talks about employment, the scarring impact of job losses, the importance of women and youth, the importance of digitization, all social policy matters are very prominent in his public discussions, and his support of, obviously, modern monetary theory or printing money. Sean, does it make you as nervous as it does Robert?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. One of the problems with history, Senator Wallin, is that the further away we get from it, the more inclined we are to forget the lessons. We've kind of pursued this strategy once before, of course, and it led to 20% interest rates in the 1980s, and we committed ourselves to avoid this kind of growing remit of central banks and instead to have them focus like a laser on controlling inflation and leaving these other important questions to elected governments. And so I certainly worry that the consequence of an expanding mandate for central banks in Canada and elsewhere is that we fall back into the challenges that we experienced in the 70s and 80s. But a big part of that really relies on governments having the kind of discipline and the focus to control their own spending. One of the things that Robert observed in a post-budget commentary that that I thought was spot on, and not just because he's here, is that budgeting necessarily involves trade-offs, we haven't, notwithstanding what the modern monetary theorists say, we haven't found a way to get rid of scarcity. And yet, one of the, if you read between the lines in Monday's budget, there were no trade-offs, and it was conceived in a world in which Minister Freeland and the government thought they had somehow managed to end scarcity. And that is no doubt puts tremendous pressure on the Bank of Canada to respond in the way that it has over the past 12 months.
But the rate at which the bank is being required to buy and continue to buy, we saw after the second wave, well, maybe we're through the worst of it now, and we'll pull back on the quantitative easing side. But boy, it's jammed right back up again. They're buying the debt. It's 40% at least, and they're buying provincial debt too.
I would say, though, that on the monetary policy report that was released this week, the governor kind of hinted that slowly, and Canada was kind of the first country to do this, that on the QE side, there would be some retrenchment from the bank going forward. I think he wanted to send a signal that this was not infinite. But I agree with you, in historical perspective, is still buying a lot of government bonds on secondary markets. So I think the danger is to become Japan, where you have monetary policy having to play a disproportionate role, and government having to also keep investing on the fiscal side, and with no real growth coming with it. That's the real danger, and I hope that we won't get trapped into this.
The other thing that troubles me is when we say with some alarm that they're buying up 40% of the debt. What about the other 60? Who's buying us? If this is more China coming in to fund, that's going to cause a whole other set of problems. Sean, thoughts?
Yeah, that's especially in a world of evolving geopolitics. One of the things, Senator Wallin, that Robert and I have written a bit about in the past couple of years is the increasing kind of melding of economics and geopolitics, what sometimes is described as geoeconomics. And countries, it's not beyond countries like China to utilize their holdings of sovereign debt around the world as part of a broader geopolitical strategy. And I think, if there's one criticism of the way that Canadian public policy makers think about China and think about these broader questions of geoeconomics is that we tend to do it in a siloed way. So something as simple and technocratic as sovereign debt is not necessarily viewed through the lens of geopolitics and Canada's position in the world. And I think there is an argument in this new evolving world of geoeconomics, what is sometimes described as the return of the great power competition between the US and China. Canada needs to be much more strategic in its public policy in general, but in particular in applying a kind of geoeconomic lens to a wide range of policy matters, including where and how our sovereign debt is held.
May I just add on that?
Yeah,
I think
please.
something that is being underestimated in this current stimulus debate is the size of the US stimulus. Essentially, the Biden administration has already brought 2 trillion, which is the size of the Canadian economy, into a stimulus. That's phase 1. And phase 2, it sounds about 3 trillion additional. That in itself will have huge impact on us, in a sense that it will carry into our economy, Canada being the biggest exporter. It will also carry in the global economy, given the size of the US economy. And so in itself, this could sustain a very healthy growth on the consumption side anyway, in the short term.
Without all of the stimulus here, we could have benefited from that.
Exactly.
Period.
So
Yeah.
this is another reason why I didn't think this 100 billion was necessary in the short term.
Agree totally. Just now that you've raised Mr. Biden, I want to follow up on something this week from the climate discussions, and the Prime Minister now promising, Sean, by law to make sure that we cut by 45% the levels in 2005 by 2030. So that's a huge request and ask, and where it hurts most dramatically and where the cuts will come most dramatically is agriculture and oil and gas, sectors that are already hurting in this new world.
Yeah, so that's it's interesting that the budget came down the same week as these renewed or stronger commitments with respect to Canada's emission targets. And there's no doubt that the type of transition envisioned in those targets will create some dislocation, and we can't be insensitive to that. I think that there's a legitimate criticism of the Trudeau government that its ambitions on climate change haven't been matched with clear transition plans for the industries and people that would be negatively affected. And I would just say, in parentheses, Senator Wallin, that if you don't have those transition plans in place, I think you're playing with real fire. This is the type of political economy dynamic that can lead to the rise of populism, the rise of polarization, and so on. And so, no matter what one thinks about these climate change goals, I think we have a kind of collective interest in making sure that the extent to which people are negatively affected, that we have a plan in place to support them, or the long-term effects on our politics and our social cohesion could be significant. But, and this is an important but, I also think that this represents a bit of an opportunity in terms of technological adoption, innovation, and so on. If there were parts of the budget where I do think the Trudeau government deserves some positive marks, it would be in this area of net zero emissions. There's a proposal for a new net zero accelerator, which ostensibly is going to seed new technologies like small modular reactors, like carbon capture and storage. Those look kind of promising and interesting. There's embedded in their 270 measures, one thing that viewers might have missed is a proposal for a preferential corporate tax rate for manufacturers that produce net zero technology. So, on one hand, the climate agenda needs to keep a close eye on minimizing disruption for industries and workers. On the other hand, I do think there is a case that this could be part of a kind of growth and dynamism agenda, and the elements around technology in the world of clean technology and net zero emissions are some of the more interesting aspects of the budget in my view.
I think you've touched on it, that what the problem is here, like in the budget, for example, on carbon capture, there were nice words, but no money, no support. And those are measures that people are taking. But are we putting, and I guess this is my concern in general, the cart before the horse? I mean, we're going to need oil and gas in the more traditional sectors for a few years yet. Yet all of the language and the focus seems to be, we're going green tomorrow. And too bad, so sad if you happen to work in the oil and gas sector. Robert?
I agree with Sean on a transition. I agree that this is not something in the best of worlds that will happen fast. And I really much like the approach, again, the Biden administration has taken on this, as opposed to this target, although their target is very ambitious as well. A more technologically driven approach, a more economic approach to climate change, which is, let's double down on R&D, let's commercialize these ideas, let's go at scale, and let's move the needle. The problem I have with the budget is a bunch of measures that are very linked to bureaucracy thinking about secretariats and programs and initiatives that won't actually accomplish anything in a few years from now, as we know with our experience in government, as opposed to really like using institutions such as DARPA in the United States or ARPA-E in the climate change case, and really bringing together the private sector's dynamism and capital and some of the public R&D to de-risk this investment to really go at scale. That's the way I think about climate change. And that's the way I think we should go about like the economic opportunity of climate change, as opposed to just, setting these crazy targets that will never be achieved. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Sean, you raised a couple of points, and I just want to, we're all kind of political junkies here, so I can't resist it. But because you've talked about rural-urban divide in this country, for those of us who live in the western part of the country, this is a reality. Even in response to things like the Conservative, their own plan on carbon tax. I hear my neighbors and people just saying, okay, that's it, right? I mean, we've got nobody that's understanding what the reality of our world is. We can't sell our canola because we're having a fight with the Chinese. Oil and gas workers are denigrated by the elites and the ruling classes as they talk about it. There's just a real disconnect between those two Canadas.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was Brian Mulroney who said that the primary responsibility of the Prime Minister of Canada was national unity, and then the second responsibility was good relations with the United States. And if you've been following politics in the advanced world for the past 5 years or 10 years, we're seeing growing polarization. We're seeing people pushing back against what they view as a lack of representativeness and responsiveness from political elites. Senator Wallin, one of my favorite phrases is the the description of the Brexit referendum as revenge of the places that didn't matter. And so, it seems to me that our political class really must recommit themselves to greater representativeness and responsiveness, because fundamentally political stability is the first order problem, right? And
Absolutely.
I think you're right to observe that there is a growing share of the Canadian population that feels like politics, governance isn't reflecting them and their interests. And that's not a partisan observation. I think,
No,
you
isn't.
would find those critiques all across the country. But we're living in a bit of a moment, I think. And, I would say, I would say that it really behooves, politicians, business leaders, people in the media and elsewhere to make sure that we're sort of recommitting ourselves to ensuring that people feel like our politics, our governance, our culture is inclusive and responsive. I don't know how you could seen how things have been folded elsewhere and not see that as one of the greatest urgencies of our political moment.
Yeah, that's the kind of rhetoric. I mean, the rig workers aren't going to become coders. And, in rural Canada, you send your children over to the neighbor lady and pay her. There's not a daycare, so we need to put that money through. Like, there's a whole different, Robert, are you getting the same sense as Sean?
I do. I'm really worried. Like Sean, I come from a small place in Quebec. And I see this disconnect between liberal elites, frankly, and the rest of the world, not just in Canada, but in the US and most of the Western world. And I think, one of the interesting approach that Biden is taking in his first days of government is including these people in the way that he approaches problems. And he's actually very popular now. He's over 70% because I think he thinks about the little guy, and it's really important. Jean Chrétien was famous for that. I think he was never part of the liberal elite, although he was in politics for a long time. He was always thinking about what his friend in Shawinigan would think about a certain issue. I think that matters a great deal.
Senator Wallin, may I just make one additional point?
Please.
And this may surprise some of the more small government conservatives on this in this discussion, especially because it's about to come from a conservative, is that the trend towards what's sometimes described as urban agglomeration, the increasing concentration of investment and jobs in a small number of superstar cities, is not a case of markets malfunctioning. It's a case of markets doing precisely what markets do, which is to allocate resources efficiently. Yeah. So if we want to sort of push back against the concentration of economic activity in a small number of places in this country, it's necessarily going to involve a role for public policy. And that's going to, that may be uncomfortable for some limited government conservatives who may be participating in today's session. But the fact is, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver represent more than 1/3 of Canadian GDP. To put that in perspective, LA, Chicago, and New York are only about 15 or 16%. They represent the vast majority of employment in recent years. They represent the vast majority of venture capital and patents, all of the kind of proxies for where growth and dynamism is happening. So, I would say to conservatives, we need to think seriously about how we can use the levers of public policy to try to push and pull capital and innovation and opportunity outside of those major centers. And it's going to take a role for government because this is a case of, what you might describe in a kind of technical sense as market failure. And a lot of work that I've been doing in recent years to think about, are there innovative ways for public policy to try to encourage private sector investment and development in places like Thunder Bay, where I'm from, where today 9 of the 10 largest employers are government or quasi-government.
Exactly.
This is a place that's exporting need and importing transfers from other parts of the country, and that's an unsustainable economy. And there are dozens and dozens of places like that across the country.
We just got a comment from one of our participants today saying, how can you have a 700-page budget that doesn't mention forestry? And it's true. I mean, you have the Prime Minister saying, oh, we should all go plant more trees in some kind of feel-good gesture, but we've got massive industries that weren't noted. Robert?
Yeah, the lack of sectoral focus in this budget is really puzzling to me, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because when I think about potential growth, I think about like ag food, I think about advanced manufacturing, I think about life biosciences, infrastructure, and none of this vision was articulated in the budget, frankly. It's more like who needs money and then more, and just give it to everyone. So I kind of agree with the.
Well,
what
on
the
that
president said.
thought, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, here we have just gone through 14 months and we're still going through the COVID crisis. Not a lot of conversation about repatriating manufacturing capacity or rebuilding pharmaceutical sectors, just as a kind of a one-off of what people have come to understand was a huge problem, that we were so exposed.
Yeah, Sean and I have written about this in the new North Star too, our lack of industrial policy in our over reliance on in today's world. Again, going back to what Sean just said, the market does its job pretty well. So governments have to be attentive to what they need for their citizens in that context. And our lack of industrial policy, thoughtful industrial policy, I think, has brought us in a place where we didn't have the stuff we needed. And I still think strategically we're very weak on many parts of the supply chains. So this is one of the things government will need to address. But more just than just seeing it defensively, where do we want to win on the global stage, I think is what is lacking in our conversation and in this budget. Is there, in the United States, there's a bipartisan bill coming up. It's called the Endless Frontier. You will recall this was FDR, Vannevar Bush kind of framing about the future after the Second World War. And the bipartisan bill, I find it very powerful because it kind of identifies 9 or 10 sectors where the US wants to win on the global stage. And we don't have that ambition in Canada. We don't know where we want to win or where we want to be strong, at least, knowing that we have, scale and critical mass capacity in Canada. But I just sense there's a lack of ambition here that is very problematic.
That's such a fundamental point, because I think that is what is kind of underneath a lot of people's reactions to the budget, which is, yes, people need help, and yes, we're throwing money at stuff right now because we're in a crisis, but to what end? Where are we going? What's the plan here? So, Sean, what do you think some next steps have to be?
Well, before I answer that specifically, just on that point, I would just observe, Senator Wallin, that lack of future-oriented vision, which is reflected in the budget, has really been permeated Canadian politics for some time. It's not just a critique of the Trudeau government. I think we've become generally complacent about growth, about the future. And one of the consequences of that, Senator Wallin, is it's reflected in polling about how Canadians feel about the future. There's a tremendous amount of pessimism in our society these days. Something like only 13% of Canadians think that their children are going to have better lives than they do. And I think that's partly a function of that they don't have a vision of a different and better future for the country, because we don't talk that way. We're sort of focused on splitting up the pre-existing pie, kind of a transactional politics, as opposed to a visionary politics that aims to grow the pie. And Robert, I think, has been a real just powerful voice for the need for a greater future orientation to our policy and politics. The question, of course, is what does that entail, as you say? And I think it involves a redoubled commitment to science and technology. This is where the kind of future growth is going to come. And we have some pre-existing advantages. You mentioned canola earlier. Here's a case where a new technology designed in Canada involving universities, government, and the private sector has now given us something like 75% of global market share and exports in a particular technology. Canola is ultimately a technology. And I think we need to think that way about other parts of of the economy. That's going to give people a sense that we have a future-oriented vision, and it's ultimately the best means of breaking out of the 2% trap that we started on when we began our conversation. That's the way we're going to grow our economy and increase opportunity for people across the country.
No, I think that's really true in this sense. We heard the Prime Minister the other day, as if it were a good thing, tell people this was at the Liberal Party convention, that 8 out of every $10 in COVID relief comes from the Liberal government. I mean, it's kind of this nanny state mindset, which is don't worry, we'll bail you out, instead of, the best employment strategy or anti-poverty strategy is to find people a job in some area that is going to actually grow. And I think you're both really reflecting that. Robert, some just final thoughts on that issue before we go back and crunch a
I've
few
been
numbers.
really worried since the beginning of this crisis, and I understand the first few months were kind of tricky to figure out.
Yeah.
And I give some loose end on the government for this, but now I still think there's way too much focus on household consumption and the way we spend money at the government level, as opposed of the productive capacity of our economy. And various people have noted this, including David Dodge and Don Drummond and people smarter than me. But I just think that it goes back to this long-term vision. These are the things that might not be popular in the short term, but that will build our economy for the future. And so when you talk about R&D, when you talk about human capital, when you talk about innovation policy, I actually think these will be the ones that'll make the difference in a 10-year, timeline, as opposed to, the next few months. I'm worried that after this crisis, in 2 years from now, we'll have double our debt, and we won't have much to show for it, to be honest. That's my worry. And I understand some of it was necessary.
Yeah.
I recognize that. But, as Sean has pointed out many times, the future focus is super important.
We Canadians are now, and I mean, the chickens are going to come home to roost here. So we do have to focus on that. Canadians now spend more of their income paying off debt than in any other G7 country. And I'm worried too that we're just getting really, not only our governments, but as individuals, we're getting addicted to cheap debt. Sean?
Yeah, I think that's that's a concern now going back more than a decade, right? We've had Bank of Canada governors, we've had the banks, we've had the Department of Finance kind of ringing the alarm bell of just kind of a country awash in debt at the corporate level, at the government level, and at the household level. And that will ultimately become a constraint on growth. Just let me give you an example. A household that is awash in debt is a household that can't relocate, in the name of a new job opportunity, or can't leave a job in order to get new training or education to boost human capital to get a better job. So it becomes a real constraint on people's abilities to respond to market signals and ultimately improve their own circumstances. So I guess just in short, Senator Wallin, it is a challenge. And it's one that at this stage, there doesn't seem to me to be much in the way that policymakers can do much to influence it. It's ultimately, I think, as much a kind of cultural phenomenon as it is a policy one. We need to kind of get back to a degree of personal and household discipline, if we want to kind of address this, growing problem.
We heard some testimony recently in front of Commons committees about the question of inflation, and it is creeping up and it's going there. And the CPI was changed. They kind of changed the basket a little bit because activity was so different in a pandemic and purchasing activity, but it showed troubling trends. And so it was kind of, let's go back. Let's just look at the stuff we ordinarily look at. Like this, we need some real economic literacy, not only on the part of Canadians, but policymakers, Robert.
Yeah, I'm worried about that too. I think the younger generation of economists have become so um, so liberal, I'd say with a small L on
Yeah.
these notions, that I think it has become dangerous. I guess I agree in the short term, there's not much danger of overeating, but I'm worried more about 2, 3 years from now, if that sustains, where it will bring us. And the short term history will say that we haven't had sustained inflation for a long time, but that may change. And nobody has been good at predicting this stuff. Mostly economists, actually, I would point out. So that's really my worry. That I go back to the various warnings that Larry Summer has put out there, and I think on this is mostly right. It's always better to be prudent on that stuff than to be overconfident that you won't have inflation.
But that was one of your concerns, Sean, that you said as a conservative, that this notion of prudence that we should have both in our homes and in government just seems to have fallen from favor.
Yeah, that conservative politicians like to use the line, if only the government, balanced their budgets like households. Well, God, if only the government balanced their budgets like households, we'd have more debt than we have. There's this sort of romantic notion of people sitting around the dining table, putting their household ledger into approximate balance. But, the evidence is clear that's not happening. And, it's hard to tell which direction the influence is going. Is it government influencing household behavior or vice versa? But the point is, I think as a country, we need to get out of this sense of complacency and satisfaction with what amounts to mostly stagnation, and instead kind of recommit ourselves to a kind of vision of more growth and dynamism. And I would just say, Senator Wallin, that I think this is a huge opportunity for Aaron O'Toole if he took it. One of the consequences of the Trudeau government choosing this progressive lane and advancing, an agenda primarily focused on expanding the welfare state. And I would say viewers may agree or disagree with that agenda, but I think it's fair to say that is the agenda. Opens up significant room for the Conservative Party of Canada on the sort of center right to articulate a focus on growth, a focus on jobs, a focus on investment, ultimately a focus on dynamism. And, I haven't yet seen from Aaron O'Toole and the Conservative Party that they recognize this opportunity and are prepared to pursue that lane. But I think if they did, they could be rewarded with a pretty significant degree of political support, because I think ultimately there's a massive share of the Canadian population that wants to hear those messages, and they aren't hearing from them from our political leaders these days.
Let me ask a question about how profound you think the changes that we're going through right now. Here we are doing this on Zoom, and we're working from home, and we've all got our setups now and a bit of lighting, and we figured out how to do it all right. And there, of course, there's a huge portion of the economy of people that must go to work, but there's a whole bunch of us that can do what we're doing. Even the Senate in Canada, slowly but surely, we figured out how to, meet and even vote remotely and all of those things. These changes that we've seen in lifestyle, which are reflected in things like the CPI that we were talking about, because we're spending money on different things. We're not traveling, we're not going to restaurants, we're not doing all of those things. What do you see as one or two permanent things that are going to have an effect on economic indicators as we go forward? Robert, do you want to start?
Sure. I see a sustained acceleration of e-commerce. I think the digital economy is there to stay, but I think that the pace of that change has shown that I think it will be a big change in the way that we were before the pandemic. I think that's the first one. The second one is our relationship with typical work, or the way we approach work, going into the office, and all this effect that has on the place that we choose to live and how we do our work. I think that may be a bit over exaggerated right now, but I do think there's some structural changes in there that people might make different choices about how they want to work and live going forward.
Sean?
Let me take that answer in a kind of slightly different direction. I think the most significant pandemic-related change, kind of structural change that will influence the future of politics, the future of economics, is actually the world's relationship with China. Fareed Zakaria says that before the pandemic, the US and China were in a kind of soft war, and coming out of the pandemic, they're in a hard war. This is our first and second largest trading partner. We know the consequences of being stuck between them because we're living that out with the two Michaels, of course, right now. I think that, Canadian polling shows that there's been a kind of sea change in Canadians' perceptions and views about China. I think the pandemic has sort of supercharged and accelerated a kind of growing great power competition between the US and China that's reflected in Joe Biden's plan around rebuilding capacities in semiconductors and all of these other kind of crucial technologies. I think Canadian policymakers need to recognize this kind of rise of geoeconomics and ensure that it's being reflected in our own domestic policy as well as our foreign policy. You guys we talked earlier about reshoring. This is an enormous opportunity to partner with the American administration on a kind of North American manufacturing agenda where we pull out of China some of these supply chains, but we do it in a continental way. And there are various other ways in which I think this kind of new world in which China and the US are in the midst of a geopolitical and technological race is going to influence and shape policy and governance in sort of profound ways.
Robert, we have given up so much, though. We have forfeited that. Can we actually get that back? Can we make that kind of partnership with the US, which was the natural thing to do in the first place? But then this China focus has taken over.
I'm a bit worried about our American ally in a sense that for their own reasons, they've become very protectionist. And you see this with Biden as well as we saw it with Trump. Biden does it with a nice smile and is much more friendly to us in a way. But I think overall, it pretty much is as protectionist as Trump was, and a bit more clever about going about it, I think. But I see huge challenges there. Who would have thought that Americans would have put tariffs on aluminum and steel from Canada? I would have never thought that. So I don't think we should take that relationship for granted, even if ideologically leaders now are more aligned than they were before the election. They are a huge challenge. And, there's some Boy Scout mentality that I think we still have sometimes vis-a-vis the Americans.
Yeah.
And I think we should, we have a lot of stuff that the world needs. We should leverage that.
That's my thing. I mean, canola, we feed the world. I mean, we're still providing so much energy. We've got so many strengths and we forfeited that. I can't thank you enough, the two of you this morning. This has been really, really interesting and informative. I know Greg is going to be yelling at me because I didn't dig down into all of those numbers. Greg, do you want to come in and say anything?
No. Thank you very much. I mean, the whole purpose of this is just to put the voice to the data, and you're speaking right to it. So it's been fabulous. I just had one question on my own, which was fitting in with this shift that's occurring. I think there's an agreement there, and it's a progressive one. Do you have any sense, like the indicators? I mean, we have CPI, we have unemployment, and so on. But one of the things that Maclean's was pushing recently was this quality of life, this notion that even in Atlantic Canada, that seems to have a different view on how they're dealing with COVID, and it's recognized, and now they're pushing for people because of the World Wide Web and their ability to move, to pull people back into the rural areas of Nova Scotia to help build up that economy. The indicators around quality of life, that suggestion, does you think that's at play at all in this part of the rebuild around the recovery?
Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll answer that. So thanks for the question, Greg. There are oftentimes, calls to sort of revisit GDP as the principal means of measuring the economic and social well-being of Canadians. And I think that there are, there's legitimate critiques that it's a pretty mechanistic and untextured way to think about how Canadians live and so on. And so some of these efforts to conceive of different indices like quality of life. I think at University of Waterloo, there's a happiness index and so on. I think there's probably something to that. But I would just say, like I said earlier, higher rates of GDP, is not everything. But if we can go from 2 to 3% on a sustained basis, a lot of the kind of social and intergovernmental governmental and regional challenges we have as a country will sort of work themselves out. George Will, the Pulitzer Prize winning economist, says the difference between 2% growth and 3% growth isn't 1%, it's 50%. And it seems to me, it may be a flawed measure, but I think it's still the right measure for thinking about the kind of overall health of Canada's economy and Canada's society. And that's why Robert and I have been so kind of focused on trying to grow Canadian GDP over the long term.
Yeah, I would just say briefly, I just want to push back against all these people that say that suddenly productivity is not important. It's the only way. Our ability to become more efficient and produce more output is the only way to raise our living standards going forward. Otherwise, if you don't accept that, you just don't accept simple economics. And I just think, it's great to have all these other indicators, and some of them I think might be worth exploring. But at the end of the day, it's about becoming more productive as a country. Otherwise, I think our future will be much less interesting that most Canadians assume.
And now with marijuana legalized and us all working at home, I don't know how productive things are going to be.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much, Senator. It's awesome.
Thanks very much, Sean Speer, who is the Public Policy Forum Fellow for Strategic Competitiveness, also with the Munk School, and Robert Asselin, who is the Vice President of Policy at the Business Council of Canada. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. That's it for the monthly. I'm Pamela Wallin.